Okay, well, welcome everybody to our next Franklin in Portrait lecture series. And it's to accompany our virtual exhibition, Franklin in Portraits, where we look at Benjamin Franklin's most famous portraits. This time, we will be looking at Benjamin Franklin drawing electricity from the sky by Benjamin West, which commemorates Franklin's famous kite and key experiment and, of course, the invention of the lightning rod. Joining Benjamin Franklin House today is Dr. George Boudreau, a cultural historian of early Anglo-America, specializing in the history of Philadelphia, the work of Benjamin Franklin, material culture and public history, and Dr. Carol Eaton-Soltis, project associate curator in the Philadelphia Museum of Art's Department of American Art, focusing on his collection of antebellum portraiture and portrait of miniatures from the 18th to the 20th century. She also oversees the museum's remarkable collection of the art by America's first artistic dynasty, the Peel family. And now I turn it over to you, George.
Thank you. Good evening, London. It is wonderful to be back in England. As I'll say on each of these programs, I just apologize that I can't take you all for drinks at the Ship and Shovel around the corner from Craven Street, but we'll all gather again soon. And I am aware, I was just told that my sweater appears purple on this camera, but I am wearing appropriate black. I know many in England are in mourning this week. Sad news of the loss of Prince Philip. So we're thinking of all of you in that. I always am amazed at these conversations we have. I'm here in my study in Northwest Philadelphia in an area known as Mount Airy, which was the home of Franklin's political associate and eventual political enemy, Chief Justice William Allen. Allen lost it because he became a Tory during the war, but that's a longer story. And it's a thrill today to get to talk with Carol Eaton-Soltis, who I have known for some years and had the great opportunity to work with in the production of this book. Am I on camera? I'm seeing Caitlin, but I hope you're seeing me. Caitlin, can you let me know, or is this visible to all of you now? A book that Margaretta Markle Lovell and I edited called A Material World, in which, in the process of editing this, I heard Dr. Soltis give a lecture on Charles Willson Peale and went to the front of the auditorium in Benjamin Franklin Hall here in Philadelphia and begged her for the paper. It was so good. She explicated Charles Willson Peale's famous painting that is on the cover of her book. This is a remarkable book, The Art of the Peels, called The Staircase Group, which you should, those of you in England should be able to run over to Hatchard's and pick up a copy this evening. Tying this, I had always thought of this as just Peale being clever and Peale painting a Philadelphia staircase. But Carol explained to us that Peale, during his time in Philadelphia, when Benjamin Franklin was also there, had copied the mode of Sir Anthony Van Dyck. And a short time after this, I was in London, I think to give a talk at the Benjamin Franklin House, and went to a show at the, I believe it was at the National Portrait Gallery, but I could be wrong on that. And there was the Van Dyck hanging, and I called Carol from London and said, my God, you're right. I've seen the original Staircase Group. So I was thrilled when she was willing to talk about one of the paintings she curates at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the famous Benjamin Franklin drawing lightning from the skies. Carol asked me to begin our program by telling you a little bit about the overlapping lives of Benjamin West and Benjamin Franklin. She allowed me to add this picture to her PowerPoint today, which is one of my favorites. And actually I used for my essay on Benjamin West and the history of Philadelphia and William Penn and Indians in the book Material World. It is, I think, a tremendous little piece of Anglo-American history. West was a Pennsylvania born. He was born in what is now Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, artist born in 1738, who went to Europe in 1760, accompanying some wealthy sons of Philadelphia merchants. They were going over to sell a grain crop, just as markets were reopening during what the British call the 7 Years' War. Pennsylvania was the breadbasket of the English Empire, and they were beginning to open up markets on the European continent. to Pennsylvania grains. Our merchants made a fortune on it in the years leading up to the American War for Independence. West planned on staying for a year or so to study the great masters, travel around Italy, and then maybe make a little bit of money going to London and painting portraits. And he never came home. He established himself very quickly in London with the help of Bishop William White and others back in Philadelphia. He sent for his girlfriend, who came to London and married him there. West eventually met his half-brother in an odd story. The brother had been left after West's father migrated to the Pennsylvania colony. His mother died. West's father remarried, and he was a product of that second union. And I think this is such a fascinating piece, because if you look at the two men at center, they are, while neither is a devout member of the Society of Friends, Father West was read out of meeting for marrying a non-Quaker, but they are in the garb, plain brown, simple cut suits, flat hats, the mark of Quakers all over the place. And if you look at the younger brother up to the right, Benjamin, now this artist of Augustin, London, he is no Quaker. He has his hair properly powdered and curled. He is wearing silks. He is, you can see the palette in his hand of his paints. And he is gazing over at what has sometimes been called an almost holy family view of the two children, Raphael on the left and young Benjamin West, named after his godfather, Benjamin Franklin. So that shows you something of the closeness of the two families during this period of time. Franklin, of course, had been living in England from 1757 to 62. We all know, I hope in this group, where he was living. And then he returned in late 1764 and lived there until 1775, when, after the Hutchinson Letters affair, in trouble with the British ministry, he headed home after the death of his wife, Deborah. So they would have been not just associates or neighbors in Pennsylvania, but also very much neighbors in London. And I have walked the path from Craven Street over to Newman Street. There is not a sign left of Benjamin West's house, which was considered a tourist site for the artistic world by the early 19th century. The last time I was there was a parking lot for postal trucks, but there was a sign up that they were going to start construction on something. So those of you in London today, please walk over to Newman Street and tell me what's there. And maybe the Friends of the Ben Franklin House could get together and sponsor a blue plaque so forgotten Benjamin West has something. As I said to Carol Soltis when we did our pre-meeting the other day, I didn't include it in this PowerPoint, but I do have a picture I love very much of the day I visited Benjamin West's grave. He was buried in 1820 with state honor in St. Paul's Cathedral, very close to the tomb of Sir Christopher Wren, of course, the famous builder of that building and so many famous buildings in London. So when West died, this nominal Quaker boy from Pennsylvania had really become a part of British society, very much a part of the mother country. And with that, I want to introduce, as I say, Carol Soltis. Carol is a phenomenal art historian. I've shown you her book, or at least I hope you could see it. As I said, I met her after her lecture, but I'm very proud to say that she is the only one of the speakers this week who I knew her mother before I knew her. Her mother, Doris Eaton, was a phenomenal supporter of the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks. And when I ran and lived in the Powell House in Philadelphia, she was a great friend and benefactor and mentor on the place, and a great deal of fun. I can remember Doris laughing and laughing over things, and was great at telling stories. And she told me she had a brilliant young daughter who was working on art history, and one day we should meet. And Carol, transatlantically, or at least we're probably about 4 miles apart right now, here we are together. So Carol, can I turn this over to you, or is there more you'd like me to say?
Thank you, George. I appreciate it very much. A wonderful introduction, great thoughts on Benjamin West. And I will change here we go, get on to the painting that we'll discuss today. And I want to thank you and everyone at the Benjamin Franklin House for inviting me to come speak. So what I would like to do this afternoon is to locate this small painting but very dynamic picture within the larger project it was part of, and then to discuss the sources and influences that shaped it. In 1800, Benjamin West received a request from the Board of Managers of Pennsylvania Hospital, that you see here in this print, to paint a picture for them. They wrote that, quote, "The works of an artist which ornament the palace of a king cannot fail to honor him in his native land," unquote. West was very pleased with the request and responded that the subject he had chosen for them was, quote, "analogous to the situation. It is the Redeemer of mankind extending his aid to the afflicted of all ranks and condition," unquote. The picture illustrates a passage from Matthew in the New Testament, which reads, quote, "And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them." West's monumental completed picture met with tremendous success when it was exhibited on its completion in London. And West was then offered the largest amount ever paid for a modern work, which was 3,000 guineas.
Wow.
Also, the movers and shakers of the London art world requested that it be destined for a new project of a national gallery that was afoot. So what was West to do? Say yes, of course. But he immediately wrote Pennsylvania Hospital and offered to create a replica. And although it did not arrive until 1817, West gifted the picture in his name and that of his late wife to the hospital as, quote, "a record of their patriotic affection for the state of Pennsylvania in which they first inhaled the vital air," unquote. It was a gift that would allow the hospital to earn a substantial income from the admissions for its display over many years, and it attracted 30,000 visitors during the first 12 months. Was shown with a pamphlet and was quite an event. It also allowed aspiring American artists to have a strong example of what a big, large, ambitious historical painting was, which was, of course, what West was so wonderful at. But West had some stipulations before sending the picture, and he wrote to the Board of Managers in March of 1816 that, quote, "when the room is so much advanced as to ascertain the time of its completion and in dry state to receive the picture, I will have it shipped for Philadelphia with its frame in a safe and proper manner. I wish it to be placed opposite the entrance into the intended room, midway of which on each side there should be a low fireplace for warming the room in winter, and over which fireplaces I will complement each with a picture." So here you can see what West envisioned. This is my little mock-up of how it might have been, although it never came to be. In the center is, of course, Christ healing the sick, and on one side is a portrait of Benjamin West. In this case, this is the one painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence in 1810. And I think he envisioned something rather similar to this. And seeing the Lawrence on one side of the Christ healing the sick, you can sort of understand why he's showing Franklin in this black frock coat and with the red drapery flying behind him, that there's a kind of visual balance being set up here between them. And you can see, interestingly enough, that next to West's portrait, in Lawrence's portrait of West here, that there is a painting on the right-hand side as you're looking, and it is, in fact, you can see figures from West's Christ healing the sick. So this was a painting that was very of the moment and linked certainly in West's mind, and hence wanting to do it. As I mentioned, the pictures that West envisioned over these two fireplaces were also noted in William Dunlap's Early History of American Art. And in there, he quotes a letter from West's pupil, C.R. Leslie, that ran, quote, I can bear witness to West's great satisfaction when he heard that the exhibition of it, Christ Healing the Sick, has so much benefited the institution. He had begun his own portrait to present to the hospital. It was a whole length on a mahogany panel. He employed me to dead color it for him, and he also made a small sketch of a picture of Dr. Franklin to present with it. The doctor was seated in the clouds surrounded by naked boys, and the experiment of proving lightning and electricity to be the same was alluded to. According to the diarist, Joseph Farrington, West spoke to Sir Thomas Lawrence on September 3rd, 1816, and Farrington recorded that West, quote, told Sir Thomas that he had been requested to send his portrait whole length to Philadelphia, and he desired the consent of Sir Thomas to copy the portrait of himself painted by Sir Thomas as being an approved likeness, and to the head only copied, he would add the figure. To this, Sir Thomas gave his consent readily. So in other words, West was going to take this portrait head, this handsome portrait head of almost 10 years earlier, that Lawrence had created, and add a full standing figure to it to flank the Christ Healing the Sick. Although West wrote the hospital that he was sending these two pictures, they were never completed, and both remained in the possession of West's family. The self-portrait was never fully realized and remained in a preliminary state. But the Franklin, which although it survives only in a small format of 13 by 10 inches, was fully conceptualized and carefully finished. The portrait of West was arguably, as I've noted, designed really to work with it aesthetically. And the idea that the artist, the portrait of West was really there to assert the artist's success and his role as a mentor of aspiring American artists. The image of Franklin was a homage to the multifaceted visionary and the man of many accomplishments, among which was the founding of Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital for the public in America. Although we can describe West Franklin as an essentially allegorical work with few naturalistic elements, it should also be noted that it is a composition indebted to two well-known earlier portraits of Franklin by British artists that prominently featured Franklin's famous experiment with lightning that took place in 1751 in Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia here. The earliest formal portrait of Franklin you see here was painted by a fellow devotee of natural science, Benjamin Wilson. Wilson, interestingly enough, had published a paper on electricity in 1746, and Franklin had written to him to compliment him on it in 1752. Clearly, there was a meeting of minds of artist and subject in this subdued and dignified portrait of 1759. Pleased with the picture, Franklin had the Wilson portrait copied and sent home to Philadelphia. But during the British occupation of Philadelphia, Captain John Andre took it from Franklin's house, gave it to a superior officer, and the portrait remained in a British collection until 1906, when it was sold and returned to America, eventually being added to the collection of the White House. Wilson's portrait may be seen as a model for others that followed in casting Franklin as a genteel man of scientific inquiry, accompanied by the pictorial attributes of lightning and scientific apparatus. Mason Chamberlain's portrait of a few years later continued this characterization of Franklin as a man of learning with his scientific instruments and flashes of lightning. In both cases, these handsome portraits were engraved and well circulated. And it appears that the iconography was well established by 1789 when West's former student, Charles Willson Peale, who was by then an artist and museum proprietor in Philadelphia, echoed it in his second portrait of Franklin, the first having been a simple bust-length life portrait painted for his gallery of notable American patriots in 1785. West, therefore, clearly had a pictorial tradition of Franklin with lightning before him, when he conceived his work for Pennsylvania Hospital. But aside from this iconography, there was also a question of a good portrait likeness to consider. West never painted Franklin from life, strangely enough, and he had grappled with this problem in his earlier unfinished commission of the signing of the preliminary Treaty of Peace in 1782. This was the precursor, of course, to the Treaty of Paris. West began this picture, begun in 1783, but probably abandoned it for political reasons. It didn't seem the right sort of trajectory for his work at that point, considering everything. The composition was intended, as I mentioned, to memorialize these early preliminary part of the piece. And the group portrait included John Adams, John Jay, Henry Lawrence, and Franklin. They had come from America, but Franklin, of course, had been living in Paris for almost a decade since the start of the Revolution. West, however, was in London, and Franklin judged it would be somewhat uncomfortable for him and others if he appeared in London at this particular time. As a result, West began to assemble a few earlier Franklin portraits to compensate for his absence. The portrait that had the greatest impact were two likenesses after the famous Duplessis portrait of 1778. One, a copy made by Joseph Wright, who had been a student of West, and the miniature after the same portrait that Franklin had commissioned as a gift for his friend Georgiana Shipley, which West borrowed with the help of Franklin's son, borrowed back from her. The Duplessis portrait was a very well-known image copied many times, and one of those Franklin particularly liked. It is naturalistic and unpretentious, and I think you can see how he used it in coming up with at least a preliminary likeness for the treaty picture. The other image West used was a print or a miniature after Weyler's portrait of Franklin. You can see the flying hair in that image, which seems to have been translated into the West portrait. The third major element of West's picture was the imagery of apotheosis, which moves the picture beyond likeness and simple attributes into the realm of the conceptual. The most famous and dramatic apotheosis image related to Franklin at this time was Marguerite Girard's print, The Genius of Franklin, after Fragonard. Here, a Zeus-like Franklin turns aside lightning with the help of the goddess Minerva. He is flanked on one side by an image of America, and underneath, on the other side, Mars, the god of war, lunges towards avarice and tyranny. It was this print that included, in Latin, below the image, the epigram composed by the French economist and statesman Anne Robert Turgot about his friend Franklin that read, quote, "He snatched the lightning from the skies and the scepter from the tyrants," unquote. It is a powerful image and one with a dynamism and energy that may have influenced West. West, however, was no stranger to images of ascent and apotheosis. And in 1783, he famously memorialized the death of two young sons of King George in this work. On the far left, it is in its engraved form. It was a picture that became a pictorial model for Rembrandt, the American artist Rembrandt Peale, Charles's son, when he created a large-scale transparency painting to memorialize Washington shortly after the president's death in late 1799. And it is likely that Peale gave a copy of this print to West when he was living in London in 1802-03. It surely would have been meant as a compliment and a homage, and one that presented another American founder in a celestial realm. Like Peale, West retained reasonably naturalistic portrait head, but he dispensed with the classical clothing seen in both Peale and Fragonard as he walked an artful line between the empirical and the imaginary. West was, in fact, a devotee of ascents and dramatic gestures. and his much celebrated classicism, which you see here, was nearly eclipsed by his powerful romanticism, which you also see here. Interestingly, West's second version of Christ healing the sick, destined for Philadelphia, included a motif missing from the earlier picture. Let's see, the vignette of the demoniac boy, who might be considered visually out of order. He is just to the top right, and that figure was added in. Why it was added in had some discussion, but it seems that it could have been in the earlier one as well. It was not dependent upon anything happening anywhere else. I would like to conclude with a word on the provenance of West's picture of Franklin. The picture had remained in the West family until it was sold by Mrs. Albert F. West at Christie's, London on 19 March 1898, where it was purchased by an individual identified as Obach, who was possibly an agent for Godefroy Mayer, who owned it by April 1898, and who created a graphic image of it seen here in 1900. At some point after 1910, it was sold to Kennedy and Company and brought to the US and sold to Mr. and Mrs. Wharton Sinkler, who donated it to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1958. Although it took a long time for West's picture to finally reach Philadelphia, it fulfilled its mission. Despite its small size, it's a picture that reminds us of Franklin's remarkable intellect, energy, and imagination. And as one hand boldly connects with the forces of nature, the other firmly grasps a man-made document, most likely the Treaty of Paris, to again assert Turgot's sentiment that he snatched the lightning from the skies and the scepter from the tyrants. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Carol. I'm delighted to get so much more background on this piece. I taught it for years before actually getting to see the original, and never understood why he painted it so small until you explained that to me. It's when I first encountered it on the walls of your museum, I remember thinking to myself, my God, it's the size of a greeting card. And well, I don't know if I'm on camera or not. I have my,
you are. I think I see you.
I was snooping. I discovered that as the panelists were allowed to find out who the participants are. So a lot of wonderful old friends with us this afternoon in Philadelphia and in London. And it looks like we have some people from around the country and the world. For those of you who are in England and haven't been to Philadelphia, you should come as soon as we're allowed to travel again. And if you don't know, I'm going to say this in my introduction to Carol, you probably know it best through the movie Rocky. It's the building behind the steps that Rocky runs up. And I assume that that's how the curators arrive at work every morning, running down the Benjamin Franklin Parkway and up the art museum stairs. I still remember I'm not a big Rocky fan, but in one of the movies he said to his kid, I was surprised to find out there's a whole bunch of famous paintings in this building back here. So it shows you the challenge of when your museum takes on another purpose. But it's an amazing collection, an amazing creation of the 19th and 20th centuries. Are you working on West at all now? I know your big project right now is rehanging the collection after a renovation of the museum galleries. You said to me recently that West has taken a new prominence in the galleries?
Well, we do. It's quite wonderful because you walk in and we have a very early portrait done by West in Philadelphia, which shows him at one part of his life, the Thomas Mifflin, of which we have the great Copley Mifflin right across from it. And then further down on the wall, we have Agrippina with the ashes of Germanicus. So we have that very classicizing picture, which I showed as part of this presentation earlier, his, West's absolute stark beautiful classicism. And then next to that, down the wall a little further, we have the Benjamin Franklin that you see here on the screen. So we've got Franklin in all modes, classicism, romanticism, early American trying to figure out how to be a painter. So a little bit of each, which is quite wonderful.
I can't wait to get back. I haven't been in the PMA or indeed in any museum in a year. So it's, I'm getting dizzy from the thought of getting to finally get back in and see it, and also to see.
Well,
Charles Peale's.
the new part, our major renovations that we've done will be open in May to the public. So mid-May, early-ish mid-May. I think
Maybe Caitlin and Eleanor can arrange a field trip from London for all of our friends there to come over.
Yeah, it'd be great. Give a tour.
It would be phenomenal. We can't see our participants today, although all I can see is a list. But if there are questions, could you post them in the Q&A and Caitlin will read them to us?
Yes, I can do. So we already have a question, which is, did Franklin view any of these paintings, and is there any record of his opinion of them?
Well, we know he loved the Duplessis painting because he had it copied and a number of times. We know that he liked the painting by Wilson, and there were others as well. Charles Wilson Peale copied the one George that said APS. I didn't show that because it doesn't have the iconography in, but that's a British picture. Also Martin, I guess, by Martin. And so he liked several of them. They are sort of different. I think he particularly liked the Duplessis, but and just the fact that he would have them, painted and reproduced. I think the irony is that actually West and Franklin knew each other very early on in Philadelphia before West even went off to England to really become the artist he became. So he was very much a fledgling artist, and Franklin generously asked him to paint a portrait of his daughter, Sarah, so that Franklin could take it to London with him when he went and not miss her so much because he'd have a portrait. But Franklin wrote home to his wife that he really wasn't particularly happy with that portrait that the very young West had painted of her. And so it may be why Franklin never actually asked West to paint his portrait again. But I don't know. It's kind of an ironic little story,
It's a bad part of my Franklin education, but I don't know if he went to the annual exhibitions. He was very much leaving the widow Stevenson at home alone every evening. He was always out at clubs or society meetings, but I'm always fascinated by the Royal Society unveilings every year. And I don't know that he went to them or if his opinion of art was something
I don't
ever sought after.
I don't think so either. This was not his first priority. It was more, talking with people of common interests about science or politics or those sorts of things. There's nothing notable that I know about that relates him to that. But he and West were, of course, friendly when they were in London together. And as you
Oh, we've lost Carol, it looks like. Let's hope her internet comes back.
Well, I find it interesting what Carol said about, him not being Benjamin Franklin not being a very art person because, well, he wasn't interested in art because he's one of the most recognizable people in portraits. So it's interesting that he didn't have any fondness for it, maybe, but, people love to recreate his image. And at one point, he was probably one of the most famous people in the entire world, and instantly recognizable.
That's right. And he loved to have copies of things made and give them to his friends, especially female friends. A lot of miniatures were created and so forth. So yes, he was happy to share his image with people. And sometimes you have artists that are less well known, but they're copying famous works of him. So there's a great proliferation of Franklin images all around. And of course, the great Udon bust, you know, which is beautiful classical image of the rational, the sort of antipode to this picture, you know, the Enlightenment gentleman, naturalistic and yet very balanced, and not with his hand in the air, connecting with lightning bolts. So very different, but that was Franklin, you know, that was the two parts of Franklin. And I think, you know, the rational and the romantic, and that powerfulness that I think, you know, the fact that West knew him as a friend, you know, certainly probably gave him the impetus to try to get an image of Franklin for his commission at Pennsylvania Hospital as someone who was a bit more than the normal human being, who was sort of transcending, who was sort of, you know, in that realm of the apotheosis. He was someone who was reaching beyond in terms of imagination and creativity and so forth. So, you know, I think that little image, tiny as it is, 13 inches, really works. So.
To return to our questioner was Catherine Nettlesham asking about did he record opinions of them. I do remember that the Wilson portrait that you showed is the one that after that scoundrel John Andre, who
yes,
I believe got a state funeral once we returned the body. He was hanged for being a spy, as most of us probably know.
Yes.
After he helped capture Philadelphia, but he's the character who Alexander Hamilton, when he witnesses the execution, goes into rapture about his masculinity and his male beauty as he walked to the gallows. And
oh my,
you know, yeah, it was one of the great. It's part of Hamilton that didn't make the musical.
Yeah.
But Franklin comments that they have left my wife a widow on the wall of our house. So Franklin
Yes.
was a little denuded.
Yes, and I think it's sort of wonderfully ironic story that Andre is the one that sort of snatches it out from under, you know. It's just a very...
And I'm embarrassed, maybe one of our British friends could say, Andre either gets a crypt at, or a state tomb at St. Paul's or the Abbey. I can't remember which. I know I've been there, but I tend to go to church in England. So he gets a very grand tomb after we bury him in a field for his American naughtiness. He's the one who hired the infamous traitor Benedict Arnold, or treated with him. So Washington didn't treat him very nicely after he was caught. But the British hanged people during the war too, so bygones. We have a question from Carrie Dethorne, who of course many of us know is the Chief Curator of Independence National Historical Park and is a future speaker in this series in June, I believe. So we'll hear from Carrie in 2 months. And she writes, Carol, wonderful talk. Would you comment on whether West considered his apotheosis of Franklin as a candidate for a publicly available engraving? And as usual, Ms. Dethorne has stumped me. I have no idea. Do you know?
Could you repeat that, George? I didn't hear the first part of that.
All right. Did West ever consider having a publicly available engraving made of his Franklin print, of his Franklin painting?
Of this picture?
Yes.
No, because you know, the point is, it never came to realization because he never sent, as I mentioned, he never sent either picture to Philadelphia. These were, and therefore neither his nor the portrait that he did based on Lawrence of himself, neither of those ever got to Philadelphia. So while they were planned, and it's interesting to know what was planned for either side, neither of them came. So we have only, and the two of these came down, the Lawrence style portrait came down in the West family also. It was auctioned early, the last we know of it was early in the 20th century. and just sort of disappeared, but it was not completed. It was basically the way Leslie left it, dead colored, and it was even offered up as a work by Leslie at one point. This one, however, being so beautifully finished, I mean, it's both totally finished in terms of its execution and in terms of its conception, but it never became the large piece that it was to be. And one of the reasons I did that mock-up on either side of the Christ healing the sick was to give you a sense of what the scale would have been of these two pictures. So this would have been a fairly large-sized picture, you know, because it had to hold that part of the wall on either side of the Christ healing the sick, over those small, low fireplaces that he wrote that he wanted in the building. You know, he didn't want a lot of dampness around in the building that he was sending these pictures over for. So he wanted to have these fireplaces. And I showed the picture of the small little painting pavilion that was part of Pennsylvania Hospital. And that, you know, there were different buildings at different times. And sometimes the Christ healing the sick was in the main building, so it moved around a bit. But for many years, there was this separate building. And this was what West wanted and asked for and envisioned. It wasn't there when the Christ healing the sick first arrived. And he did not send these other two pictures that he planned to do, basically because this is a late life picture. As I mentioned, this is, you know, the last few years of West's life, becoming increasingly unwell and probably not having the energy to make this into a large picture or to redo a sort of self-portrait either. So these sort of fell by the wayside. It was a good intention that never was met.
Carol, was West, like some painters, injured by his painting from the use of white lead, et cetera? Did that affect his health?
I don't know. I mean, he lived a long enough life, you know, but I don't know that. Someone else would have to answer that one.
When I was first working on West for my essay in Material World, I used the collections at the Paul Mellon Center. And one of the things they had that was really remarkable was a marked up copy of West's estate auction catalog. So for those of you in London, I don't know if the Paul Mellon Center over in Bloomsbury is open right now, but they have one from just after his death in 1820, where the person has gone in and made comments about what's up for auction. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to look at that, but you know, there's just this marvelous collection of Anglo-American art, you know, going for what we spend for lunch now in London. So it's, and Kate Ono, who is an editor of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin at Yale. For those of you who are new to Franklin Studies and want to know more, www.franklinpapers.org is my great website to use. Kate writes that she believes that Franklin's home in Philadelphia was full of images and busts of his friends. And she writes, she thinks of Judith Sargent Murray, the wife of a preacher who came through Philadelphia in the early 1790s. And Murray wrote a description of her visit to the house. It's a really wonderful description shortly after his death, and a couple of other descriptions. And I think that's true. Franklin, like Washington, like Jefferson, was a head collector, to use Margaretta Lovell's phrase. One of the things I find in response to Kate, I find it amazing that while he was in England, Deborah, his wife, bought the original Williams oil painting of the abolitionist Benjamin Lay. So, and he writes to her and says, well, now you have a picture of Ben Lay on your wall, which it's an odd painting, and I can't imagine.
Yes, there's a print made after it. Yeah.
You know, but the fact that they owned it, I don't really know where it is currently. I haven't followed its provenance, but.
I don't know where the picture is, but we were just given the engraving after the picture here at the museum, which is a great thing to have.
Yeah. Lay has been the subject of a recent biography and is a fascinating character. And of course, he's one of the people who I think is influencing Franklin over time to go from being a slave owner and a slave merchant at times into being an abolitionist. I think his abolitionist story is a very important part of his his life narrative. And did West paint any African Americans? There's an odd question, Carol. Do you know that answer?
Well, I think it's certainly possible, but they probably would have been painted in the context of a courtly setting, for want of a better word. You know, someone who was ambassadorial, or someone who was in service, or, you know, I would not say that there's nothing comes popping into mind right immediately, but I can't imagine there wouldn't have been something at some point. You know, how we have to struggle with these things today in terms of, you know, the narrowness of the representation.
The London they're living in is undergoing massive transformation at this period of time. And unfortunately, I don't follow West much after the revolution, when, you know, although he does put a nice exclamation point on the end of it when he's painting George III as the official history painter, and the king says to him, "What do you think Mr. Washington will do if he wins this war?" And West makes the bold statement, "I think he'll go back to his farming."
Oh, yes, right.
And George III says to him, and of course West is never, he's never the most circumspect person, says, "Well, if Washington does that, then he will go down as one of the great men in history."
Here we go.
Poor King George, you know, had a bit of a rough patch after that.
They did. Well, he was, you know, King George was sort of ill. I mean, and, you know, some people have looked at the demoniac son in Christ healing the sick and making it a reference to George III, but that's sort of been dismissed. You know, the whole idea of madness, and also that's been connected to the work of Benjamin Rush at Pennsylvania Hospital for mental illness, that was, you know, sort of part of that. But it's also arguing on the other side is that those things could well have been included in the first picture. They didn't sort of happen between the two versions or something like that. Those things were both operative. So that may not be the case. I think it was more that he really wanted to maybe make that picture a little more interesting and energetic than the first version was, which unfortunately is not out on display or anywhere anymore. So
is it privately owned, or is it in a museum?
No, I believe it's still owned by the Tate, and I believe that it was badly damaged, and that therefore it is stored as opposed to displayed. I don't know if there's any more recent news than that about it, but I think that's what Winterthur and Staley have published in their catalog raisonné of Benjamin West. So it's certainly interesting how he does later in his life, about the time of George III's madness, he falls well out of fashion. The Prince Regent doesn't like his work, and Queen Charlotte didn't trust him. She thought he was too much of an American, and he was, you know, having the enemy, you know, literally in their back bedroom. So there was no great love lost there. I don't think the Queen attended his funeral at St. Paul's. Probably not.
And Phil Kreider, who is a part of the Franklin House co-program with Christ Church Philadelphia, and a world-renowned expert on lightning, writes, if you could give him some more background on the Mason Chamberlain picture.
The Chamberlain. No, well, actually, that belongs to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I think someone is going to speak on that in this series. Isn't that so? Or it's been offered to someone to speak on the Chamberlain
I'm not
portrait?
100% sure. The series is still shaping up, so I'm not sure.
Okay, well, that was one of the pictures that were to be explored. So I do not personally know a great deal about that. That is in our collection of European paintings, even though this one is sort of technically also, but West is American, quote unquote. So I can't tell you a great deal about that. I can't drill down into that picture, but I think it was very much in the genre of not doing him strictly as an Enlightenment gentleman. You know, there's that whole genre of painting in the 18th century of, you know, learned, enlightened men at their desks thinking and so on and so forth. And this just takes that, like the Wilson, just takes it another step by, introducing very definite, scientific apparatus into it. And then the addition of lightning, which is an unusual thing, having something external come into a portrait. You see objects and things in portraits very, very frequently. You don't end up looking out a window a lot and seeing lightning striking. So, that whole motif of doing that, I think, feeds into what West ultimately ends up with. How can you show Franklin without lightning, both in terms of this initial famous thing he did, which of course created his reputation in Europe. He gets to London and he's already a member of the Royal Academy. He's already been sort of certified as, a special person that people want to meet. So how do you make lightning is a wonderful attribute for Franklin. And the whole scientific apparatus thing, because it's just a great open door into who he was and the moment. So
it became, by his maturity, it became a nickname for him. When West's great sponsor, the Reverend William Smith, who was the first provost of the College of Philadelphia, now Penn,
right,
delivered his official eulogy, and Smith and Franklin did not get along very well, and Smith was not a very popular character in Philadelphia by this point. But when he gave this eulogy in 1790, his daughter, walked up to him and she wrote that she whispered in his ear, "Oh, Papa, did you believe one word you said about old Ben Lightning Rod?" So he had become synonymous with the thing.
we can go back and look at that other portrait if you want to.
Yeah, it'd be great. Kate Ono writes, "I wonder if the demonic sun was related to Franklin's work on therapeutic electricity." And I can't tell you that. I mean, I know
can't tell you that either, but no.
When I broke my leg and they strapped me into a machine shooting electricity through my injured ankle, I kept thinking this would be a great way to kill a Franklin specialist. But do you want to back up to show the Chamberlain painting?
I was trying to, and I've had a couple of problems with my computer here, and I don't know exactly what is going to happen.
You should just be able to hit backspace to get there, but
I know, but it's not working.
Oh,
you should.
Don't blow the thing up.
Yeah, I don't know whether to hit escape or not.
It's been I've had a semester
that doesn't
of
work
disappearing
either,
speakers.
Actually. Maybe it's because it's already in this mode. I don't know, but whatever it is, whether it's my computer or not, I don't know. But I cannot get anything that you would think would do that to do it. So apologies.
We have a few minutes left. Have we any questions from our international audience? I threatened Caitlin at the beginning that I was going to start the program by singing Jerusalem, but I don't think I'll end it that way.
No, don't do that.
Oh, that would be it.
Well, I think just to say about the, him being, you can't talk about Benjamin Franklin without thinking of lightning and the lightning rod. I mean, even to this day, that's usually what people most know him for. So even if they don't, a lot of people internationally might think that he was a president because he's obviously so famous. But normally if you speak to somebody about Benjamin Franklin, they'll say, "Oh yeah, the lightning rod, lightning." So and I'm interested maybe that these sort of depictions of him with lightning kind of play into that these paintings that we still see today that involve lightning kind of help perpetuate that that's kind of what he's most famous for.
Yeah, and also I think this picture, which I just mentioned in passing, he's got this parchment thing, this document in his hand, in his left hand. And I do think, since West was involved with this whole Treaty of Paris picture that never got finished either, that probably is the balance of, the political Franklin, his political role internationally, and the scientific, and rather than just being a piece of paper that was on an enlightened scholar's desk, I think there's no reason not to think that it's very possible that that's a reference to the Treaty of Paris that ultimately made peace between the nations. So, you know, the political Franklin.
I always think of, Wes, that it must have been bizarre to be a colonial-born American living in England through the War for Independence. Not terribly a popular stand with everyone there.
No, well, he was in France, I mean, but
Caitlin and Eleanor and co, I've always wondered if Mrs. Stevenson faced any backlash for having been his longtime landlady and friend from the neighbors as the war raged on, but I don't know that. I've never found a way to track that story.
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear. We don't have any sources of that either. But we do know that, you know, Polly went to Philadelphia kind of, you know, right after. So, you know, so there was maybe, and I know that was partly so that she could be reunited with Franklin, who she had this great connection with when he was living in London. But I don't know if that was maybe partly because people associated the family with Benjamin Franklin, maybe, and the Americans. This has not been proven, so just the theory.
I don't know that there are many papers, you know, with the Stevens or with the Hewsons, Polly's family, emigrating so soon after the war. You know, you don't pack everything, and what they did bring along with them was pretty remarkable. And of course, the Hewsons still survive. I don't know any of them personally, but they're still actively involved in Franklin events and such.
yeah, I met one, and he was involved, his daughter was involved with some sort of a historical film on the house. It was a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow.
And the bones, do you remember that? Yeah, what was going on in the basement, kind of with scientific experiments and so forth, and neighbors.
Yes, so those
There's
of
a
you who
Hewson
have
living
not,
in Philadelphia.
I
Sorry.
was just going to say for the audience, those who haven't been to the Benjamin Franklin House in London, that statement might have sounded quite odd about the bones in the basement, but essentially when they did the restoration of the building in the 1990s, they found over 1,200 pieces of skeleton in the basement, and they had a coroner come in, and it was clear these were 18th century bones. And what was discovered was that the daughter of the landlady, Polly, was married to a doctor called Dr. William Hewson. He had an anatomy school. Well, what used to be the garden is now the basement. So in the garden, and so they would have buried, unfortunately, the bodies that they experimented on. So that's why you have all those bones there. So it's not as insidious as it sounds. But if you do come to London, please do visit. We do have some of the bones on display in the basement.
And I was once interviewed for a program on Franklin by the History Channel, and they, you know, it's very staged, but the question they asked me was Benjamin Franklin a serial killer? And every time I responded to this question, which they ask over and over, I would begin with, well, no. And they said, well, please don't answer with no. And I'm like, I think maybe the version finally aired was, no, that's a preposterous idea. Well, we have another question. I guess this will probably be our last for our time. Santiago Suarez, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, writes from San Francisco. The talk began at 9 Pacific Standard Time, right in the middle of his workday. Will the talk be available to watch after it's over?
And I can confirm that that's the case. It is being recorded right now. So it'll be on our website and on our YouTube channel and on the Bloomberg Connects app. So yes, please do watch it again.
It's nice to think of this being transatlantic, but it's also, we have participants from California and Arizona at least. So if you're somewhere else, post it in the chat so we know you're here. And I'll give my NAG, Marcia Belasciano, the executive director, may shake her head in wonder every time I say this, but if you're not a friend of the Franklin House London, please join. It is a tremendous site that I'm delighted and proud to get to volunteer as a part of their work. From the first time I went over as a professional to London, I asked if I could give a free talk to, as Franklin liked to say, keep the chain of friendship shiny and bright. I long to be back on Craven Street and taking the staff to the Ship and Shovel. I wish we could do that now, although I'm not having a beer in the Franklin Memorial seat at 1 in the afternoon. I'm not English, this is too early for me. I want to thank Caitlin and Eleanor and Marcia for the invitation, and thank my wonderful old friend Carol Soltis for being a part of this today. What a tremendous thing. I likewise long for the day we can walk through the PMA together again.
Yes, I look forward to it, George.
We're now doubly jabbed
Okay.
here on Boyer Street, so a museum visit is possible soon, I guess. It would be nice to see a painting again and to leave this room where I spend most of my life.
Well, thank you so much for everybody for joining us, and to George and Carol for this presentation. And it will be available online, so please do visit our website. And we hope to see you next month. The next in this series is actually going to be about the Charles Wilson Peel portrait that's after the David Martin of Benjamin Franklin in London. So please do tune in for that. And thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Bye.
I love that these are popping up so you can all see those in the Q&A. Peace be with thee. Thanks so much.